The year is 2025. A shadow has fallen over the once unthinkable alliance between Canada and the United States, driven by former President Donald Trump's return and his protectionist policies. Canada pivots to Asia, forging new energy partnerships, particularly with China, through the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, boosting Alberta's energy exports and reducing reliance on the U.S. Canada has long been a vital energy supplier to the U.S., with millions of barrels of crude oil and natural gas flowing south daily, creating a deeply intertwined economic relationship. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, completed in 2024, triples capacity, allowing Canada to access Asian markets, despite environmental and Indigenous opposition. Canada's pivot to Asia aims for economic diversification and reduced U.S. dependence, with China offering a vast market for energy exports and long-term contracts. Canada must balance deepening ties with China while maintaining its relationship with the U.S., navigating a complex web of alliances and economic interests. The Trump administration's tariffs on Canadian goods and energy mark a fundamental shift in U.S. economic policy, threatening decades of integration and cooperation. Trump's tariffs disrupt Canadian industries from manufacturing to forestry, casting long-term uncertainty over the energy sector and future investments. The Canadian government responds to tariffs with aid packages, legal challenges, and support for affected industries and workers, emphasizing adaptation and resilience. Prime Minister Trudeau's strategic response to tariffs includes diplomatic efforts, rallying allies, and targeted retaliatory measures, aiming to uphold international trade rules and protect the Canadian economy. Section 2. Striking Back, Targeted Retaliation. Canada's measured approach did not last forever. As the Trump tariffs began to bite, inflicting real economic pain on Canadian businesses and workers, the Canadian government felt compelled to escalate its response, abandoning its initial restraint in favor of targeted retaliation. These retaliatory measures, carefully calibrated to exert pressure on key U.S. constituencies, signaled a new phase in the trade conflict, one marked by a willingness to inflict reciprocal economic pain. One of Canada's most potent weapons in this trade war proved to be its control over electricity exports to the United States. Ontario, Canada's most populous province and a major electricity generator, opted to flex its muscle, imposing a 25% surcharge on all electricity exports to neighboring U.S. states, including New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. This surcharge, coming at the height of summer when demand for electricity is highest, sent shockwaves through the U.S. Northeast, driving up energy prices for consumers and businesses alike. Beyond energy, Canada targeted a range of U.S. products for retaliatory tariffs, carefully selecting items that carried symbolic weight and held political significance in key U.S. states. American bourbon, a source of pride in Kentucky, a state represented by then-Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, found itself slapped with a hefty tariff, as did iconic American products like Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Levi's jeans. These targeted tariffs, while primarily symbolic in nature, served to underscore the interconnectedness of the two economies and the potential for economic pain to be inflicted on both sides of the border. They also served as a stark reminder that Canada, despite its smaller size, possessed leverage of its own in this trade dispute. Section 3. The Nuclear Option Energy Embargo. As the trade war escalated, speculation mounted that Canada might be prepared to play its trump card, a full-blown energy embargo on the United States. Such a move, while unthinkable just a few years prior, now seemed within the realm of possibility, as the Trump administration's aggressive trade policies and dismissive rhetoric toward Canada had shattered long-held assumptions about the inviolability of the bilateral relationship. The prospect of a Canadian energy embargo sent shivers down the spines of U.S. policymakers and energy analysts alike. The United States, heavily reliant on Canadian oil, natural gas, and electricity, would find itself scrambling to replace these imports, potentially facing price spikes, shortages, and economic disruption. The potential consequences of such an embargo extended far beyond the realm of economics. A sudden cutoff of Canadian energy would force the United States to reevaluate its energy security strategy, potentially leading to greater reliance on less stable or environmentally friendly sources of energy. It could also strain U.S. relations with other allies, as the United States would likely lean on them to make up for the shortfall in Canadian energy supplies. While the Canadian government remained tight-lipped about its willingness to actually implement a full-blown energy embargo, the mere threat of such action served as a powerful deterrent, reminding the Trump administration of the potential economic and geopolitical costs of its protectionist policies. Section 4. The unraveling of USMCA. Trump's tariffs, far from achieving their stated aim of bringing back manufacturing jobs and reducing the trade deficit, had instead set in motion a chain of unintended consequences, threatening to unravel the very trade agreement they were ostensibly designed to protect, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. The USMCA, a hard-fought renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, better known as NAFTA, had been touted by the Trump administration as a major victory for American workers and businesses. However, the imposition of tariffs on Canadian goods, in direct contravention of the spirit and letter of the agreement, called into question the United States' commitment to free trade and its willingness to abide by international agreements. Canada, angered by the Trump administration's blatant disregard for the USMCA, began to explore ways to retaliate within the framework of the agreement, challenging the legality of the tariffs through the agreement's dispute settlement mechanism. These legal challenges, while unlikely to provide immediate relief, served to highlight the contradictions in U.S. trade policy and to undermine the credibility of the Trump administration on the world stage. Mexico, caught in the crossfire of the U.S.-Canada trade war, also began to express its displeasure with the Trump administration's actions, threatening to retaliate against U.S. tariffs on Mexican goods and to seek closer trade ties with other countries, including China. The prospect of Mexico, a key U.S. ally and trading partner, drifting away from its orbit, added to the growing sense that Trump's trade policies were backfiring spectacularly. Section 5. A high-stakes game of chicken. The trade war between the United States and Canada had become a high-stakes game of chicken, with each side refusing to back down, even as the economic and political costs continued to mount. The Trump administration, doubling down on its America First rhetoric, showed no signs of relenting, convinced that its tariffs would eventually force Canada to capitulate to its demands. Canada, however, refused to be intimidated. Backed by a united populace and a growing chorus of international condemnation of Trump's actions, the Canadian government stood firm, determined to defend its interests and its values, even if it meant enduring short-term economic pain. The question now was, who would blink first? Would the Trump administration, facing mounting pressure from U.S. businesses and consumers suffering the consequences of its own tariffs, finally agree to come to the negotiating table in good faith? Or would Canada, its economy feeling the strain of the prolonged trade dispute, eventually be forced to make concessions, potentially sacrificing its long-term interests for the sake of short-term economic relief? The outcome of this high-stakes game of chicken remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. The relationship between the United States and Canada, once considered a model of friendship and cooperation, had been irrevocably altered. The trust that had long underpinned this relationship had been eroded, replaced by suspicion, resentment, and a growing sense that the two countries were drifting apart. Section 1. Shifting sands of global trade. The U.S.-Canada trade war accelerated deglobalization, causing uncertainty in international trade. Nations retreated behind protectionist barriers, prioritizing national interests. Canada's pivot to Asia signaled a broader realignment. The EU, caught in the cross-currents, sought to maintain dialogue while strengthening its economic sovereignty. The EU's response highlighted the challenges of navigating a world defined by great power competition and shifting alliances. The economic fallout from the US-Canada trade war was not confined to the two combatants. The interconnected nature of the global economy meant that the shockwaves from this transatlantic trade dispute were felt far and wide, disrupting supply chains, increasing costs for businesses, and fueling inflation. Nowhere were the consequences of this trade war felt more acutely than in the northeastern United States, a region heavily reliant on Canadian energy imports. The 25% surcharge imposed by Ontario on electricity exports to the U.S. Northeast sent electricity prices soaring, forcing businesses to curtail operations and homeowners to grapple with skyrocketing energy bills. The price hikes, coming at a time of already high inflation, fueled a wave of public anger and resentment, putting pressure on local and state governments to provide relief. The economic pain inflicted by the tariffs provided a stark illustration of the costs of protectionism, undermining the Trump administration's claims that its trade policies would benefit American workers and businesses. The trade war also had unintended consequences for the global energy market. Canada's decision to redirect a portion of its energy exports to Asia, coupled with the uncertainty surrounding future U.S. energy policy, contributed to volatility in global oil and gas prices. This volatility, while creating opportunities for some energy-producing countries, also raised concerns about energy security, particularly in regions heavily reliant on imports from politically unstable regions. The trade war exposed and exacerbated existing cracks in the U.S.-Canada relationship, a partnership long considered a bedrock of North American stability and prosperity. The Trump administration's aggressive trade tactics and dismissive rhetoric toward Canada had shattered the illusion of a special relationship, leaving behind a residue of mistrust and resentment that would take years, if not decades, to repair. The dispute over tariffs paled in comparison to the damage inflicted on the intangible bonds of trust and shared values that had long united the two countries. Canada, accustomed to being treated as a trusted ally and partner, felt betrayed by the Trump administration's willingness to weaponize trade for political gain. The United States, accustomed to Canada's unwavering support on the world stage, chafed at Canada's refusal to toe the line on trade, perceiving it as a sign of disloyalty and a challenge to its authority. This erosion of trust, coupled with the Trump administration's broader agenda of questioning long-standing alliances and commitments, raised profound questions about the future of the U.S.-Canada relationship. The political fallout from the trade war extended beyond the bilateral relationship, spilling over into domestic politics on both sides of the border. In Canada, the trade dispute served as a rallying cry for national unity, reinforcing a sense of Canadian identity distinct from that of its southern neighbor. In the United States, the trade war further polarized an already divided electorate, fueling anxieties about globalization and the perceived decline of American power. The political consequences of this trade war, much like the economic ones, would continue to be felt long after the tariffs themselves had been lifted. The trade war between Canada and the United States marked a watershed moment in the global order, accelerating the fragmentation of the post-World War II international system. The rules-based order, constructed to promote free trade and multilateral cooperation, found itself under assault from rising nationalism and protectionism. Canada's pivot to Asia took on strategic significance, recognizing the shift of global economic gravity eastward. The rise of China presented both challenges and opportunities. For the United States, the trade war represented a strategic blunder. By alienating allies, it ceded ground to China. China positioned itself as a reliable global partner. The trade war between Canada and the United States disrupted supply chains, increasing costs for businesses and consumers and fueling political polarization. The tariffs, initially touted as a quick fix, proved to be a blunt instrument, inflicting collateral damage on businesses and workers far beyond those directly targeted by the levies. The economic costs of the trade war fueled resentment and mistrust between neighbors, communities, and family members. The political rhetoric, often laced with nationalist overtones and thinly veiled xenophobia, poisoned public discourse, making it difficult to find common ground.